January 11th. It should be Thursday or Friday, the week of the, I don't know, maybe it's about 24th, 25th. This is the end of the first week, but it's the beginning of a new topic. One of my favorite topics of the year, which is a sad thing that we cannot do it in class. But it's pretty amazing. It's got a lot of psychology in it and a lot of history. It begins with the Industrial Revolution. So now I see a lot of people writing things like 4.0 world or something like that. I don't know what that means. That's not really part of the English language, so I wouldn't use that term. Some people might call it the computer revolution or the digital revolution. Those are acceptable, we all understand that. But 4.0 is just something that they wrote in a Vietnamese newspaper and is not really translated from English. So we don't know what 4.0 means. The idea of management, that's what this is about. So human resource management, but now we're talking about management of employee motivation. This is in the maintenance phase of the employment cycle, right? Maintenance means we want to get the most out of our employees. The concepts that we maybe thought about so far were training, being able to have performance reviews, listening to employees, setting KPIs, having very clear tasks and job descriptions. So all of those things, oh, and rewards. Rewards is a huge part of motivation for many people. So we go back to those ideas eventually, but I think that it's very useful to go back to the beginning of motivation in the workplace. If you, so with 4.0, I don't know if it's 4.0 or 2.0 or what point oh, but one of the point O's was called the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was a huge change in the ability, well, it was the beginning of mass production. Like agriculture gave us a little, farming. The beginning of farming means that people could live in one place, and it led to the development of cities and kingdoms. So that was a pretty powerful revolution. And the Industrial Revolution also was life-changing for all of us, to the point where we can fly and spread pandemics in weeks, that we can record, that we all have a computer. Okay, so mass production, right? This is the beginning of mass production. It has some great upsides, the Industrial Revolution, wealth creation. There were, all the technology, a little bit of equality in the ability of people to share in some of the technological benefits that were created. It also led to the first industrial wars. So when you have factories, it changes your war, right? Because you don't have to make your weapons at home. You don't have to call a blacksmith to have guns made. You can just have an assembly line and create guns, tanks, bombs, whatever. So, so the Industrial Revolution also changed warfare, led to the technology that brought us airplanes and cars, trains, steam engines, the ability to shift resources far across the globe. All these things. But it starts with the end of the agricultural revolution. So there wasn't really an idea yet about the Industrial Revolution. It kind of happened by a few guys in Manchester, England, who had this idea that they could produce more in a bigger building and like hire people into, it wasn't called a factory at that time, but it became a factory eventually. The growth of these textile clothing manufacturing systems in England led to a relationship with the United States that depended more and more heavily on cotton, and also more and more heavily on slavery in the United States. So a lot of the wealth of the United States was made from slavery, slave labor, and that was used by England to get the material, the cotton that they used to make all the clothing. And then England became rich from selling all their clothing all over the world. So it worked out for to build wealth for both of those countries. But how do you get someone to work in a factory in a city, right? The cities were quite small. Most of the cities were just there for shipping, boats, trade. People would go there to go to a bank or some things, their government offices, but there wasn't a big city like we have today with millions of people and shops. That was the result of the factories being moved to those cities. People didn't go to the city thinking, oh, I'm going to go get a job in the factory. There was, before they worked in the factory, they worked on a farm. This is the like 1800, right? Late 1870s, around 1800, right? Beginning of the 19th, end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. In England, where this all started, there were farms, and families basically had the rights to work the land, and if they worked the land, they could keep what they made. At that time, they had to give some money to the king. It was still a kingdom at that time. And so most people just made enough for themselves. They worked in the spring and to the fall, and the winter was pretty quiet time, lots of fires, you know, just kind of a classic agricultural economy. Eventually, someone came up with the great idea that the land should be owned by people. It wasn't free land anymore, so they had this thing where they closed off all the land, and there was nowhere for these peasants, is what they were called at the time. The peasants had no place to work. So they were pushed into the cities and pushed into the factories, the new factories that were opening up. So all of a sudden you have all these peasants who live in the city. You can imagine what the city was like at that time, pretty wild. Where are they going to live? So the factories built these huge, monstrous apartment buildings. The architecture at Manchester today is really interesting to look at. But they had a huge factory, and they didn't have cars. So pretty much within walking distance on a rainy day, you could go from these big apartments to the factory. It was all right there. It wasn't like a fun city environment. Now, culture came out of that eventually. So in the factory, these workers came from all over. Wasn't as nice as the farms, right? Farm life must have seemed like a dream before city life. It wasn't the great city, you know, lifestyle that you would imagine today. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you a little video that has to do with the working conditions in the factories. So these new factories had, you know, really, really bad, really poor working conditions.
The Industrial Revolution in Britain led to the luxurious lifestyle of, while the
guess that's the best we'll get to sell.
The Industrial Revolution in Britain led to the luxurious lifestyle of the industrial middle class. The industrial working class suffered due to the poor conditions of their jobs. Women and children as young as 5 years old made up 2/3 of the cotton mill workforce. They worked in harsh conditions for 12 to 16 hours each day, 6 days a week. The workers did not stop for meals. There was no security of employment, and women were required to work while pregnant. The mills were crowded, dimly lit, poorly ventilated, dirty, dusty, dangerous, and unhealthy. Workers suffered from digestive problems, lung pains, side pains, and often their hands and feet hurt. The workers were treated very poorly in the mills. Their pay was deducted for making a mistake. They were required to work while pregnant, and child laborers were often beaten for making mistakes or falling asleep on the job. The wage of these workers was very low. In fact, winders were paid only 2 to 4 shillings a week, and weavers 5 to 8 shillings a week. Men, women, and children as young as 5 years old all worked over 12 hours each day, 6 days a week, in the dangerous conditions of the coal mines. The mine workers experienced cave-ins, explosions, tight conditions, constant dampness, flooding, exposure to gas fumes, and poisonous gases. Each day, mine workers risked entrapment, body deformity, ruined lungs, loss of limbs, and death. In fact, 349 deaths occurred in a single coal mine in only 1 year. 58 of these deaths were of children 13 years or younger. In the mines, death was caused by falling down mine shafts, explosions and cave-ins, suffocation by poisonous gas, or getting run over by a tram. Child laborers were hurriers. They carried over 50 pounds of coal through the mines, and they were only paid 1 shilling per week, yet they had to pay for their own candles. Teams of women physically operated the machinery that brought mine workers and coal in and out of the mines, even while pregnant. It was a job that men refused to do, yet they were paid only 5 shillings per week. Men mined coal from inside the mines and were to be paid 10 to 15 shillings per week. But there were many fines and fees deducted from their pay. They were charged for the usage of candles. They were fined if the quality of the coal they produced did not meet the high expectations of the mining company. Just like the cotton mills, there was no security of employment and no protection laws. Workers during the Industrial Revolution faced long hours, poor working conditions, hard work, and minimal pay. While the Industrial Revolution was a time of great success, the success was not shared by everyone.
Okay, wow, right? So there you go, right? You had these horrendous kind of working conditions. If you lost an arm, if you lost a family member, no payment, just the factory just replaces you with another human being. I don't know how much 1 shilling or whatever was back in that time, but I'm sure it wasn't much money to spend. The idea that the workers had to provide their own candlelight in order to work was is particularly amazing to me. So, unbelievable working conditions, very poor living conditions. The diseases that were spread by all these new workers living in these very crowded, poorly made apartment buildings. Lots of death from that as well. In order to build a city and to have a factory and to have apartments, you have to have electricity, which they didn't really have, so they had a lot of candles still. Eventually they would have some electricity, but that took many years. The factory ran on coal, so that's why they needed so much coal, right? To keep the machines going. Not to give people electricity, but to keep the machines going. and the trains that would take the products to the port. Also for a city and its infrastructure, you need to have a proper water system. So that's a hard thing to build. That takes a lot of workers. That takes a lot of time. And for it to be safe, it's, you have to be able to burn, and until then you have to burn the water, right? You have to boil the water in order to take out the bacteria. And so everybody has to have coal. There's little fires everywhere. You've seen coal fires in Vietnam. They're all over the place. So it's very smoky all the time and dirty. Still have trouble washing. Where's the place to wash, right? We don't have showers. So it's really dirty and horrible. A lot of the workers, of course, they said that they work 60-hour weeks, so 70-hour weeks, so that's 10 hours a day, maybe more, and then so there's only some limited amount of time after work, 7 days a week, of course. So after work, though, the people were, there's a lot of alcoholism and a lot of family problems that came out of this as well. Beer was actually safer to drink than water because it was already processed and already boiled. So it was actually safer to drink alcohol. You had some people who probably came to the workplace drunk already and then made workplace accidents for other people. So it was a pretty, that's the foundation of the modern world that we live in now, is that. For many years, decades, the idea was the workers are replaceable. Only in the late 1800s did someone start to consider what was happening. And maybe even there was some competition, and workers were starting to get, they were starting to fight back. Workers were kind of tired of the situation. And there was riots, right? There was a group of people called the Luddites. These people attacked the machines in the factory and smashed the machines. The workers were treated so badly that Karl Marx came up with his theory of Marxism, and how capitalism was always going to hurt the workers, and that the workers needed to revolt against the capitalist owners of the factories. So all of this stuff was happening, and there was sort of a kind of there's an idea that there needed to be a change. In the factories at that time, there were still a lot of people, there were different levels of workers. There was the child labor and the simple labor, but then there was a higher level labor. There were some people who could make bicycles. There were people who could knew how to make things, like complete things, right? They could make, they would work as blacksmiths or whatever, and they could make shovels, or not just one piece of a shovel, but the whole shovel. They understood their craft. They were actually craftspeople on some level. They had skills. This kind of thinking was kind of, there was a new vision about how to manage work. And that was, I'm gonna show a video now which is introducing a guy named F.W. Taylor. And he was the one who kind of shifted the factory system away from throwing away workers, but trying to get them to produce more, to increase their productivity instead of just, getting rid of them. And it was kind of in part to help the workers, but it was also difficult to change the thinking of the workers as well.
Frederick Taylor is a founding father of organizational studies.
His scientific management approach has surely touched many aspects of your professional life, as you will see. He was a mechanical engineer and a management consultant. That meant that he was an outside person that would come into organizations to try to help them make things better. Factories at the time were springing up everywhere, and standardized ways didn't yet exist to manage large groups of people and handle increasingly complex work.
So there wasn't a real theory about how to manage. There were just these kind of, it was almost like a military, right? You had these kind of managers who would just, punish and beat the employees, and never tried to really find out what would make the factory better. So there was no standard way. There was no, this is before we get to this kind of hierarchical structure of management and the traditional hierarchical structure. And this guy, he was involved in the idea of efficiency.
Increasingly complex work. So Taylor saw this need and he wanted to step in and make organizations more standardized, efficient, and productive by studying their work processes closely. Scientific management is the term he used. He did a lot of studies and wrote books about it. It's basically meant applying science to work, studying tasks carefully, systematically.
Science, maybe math. Math is more clear, rather than science. But he studied the jobs of the workers, right? He broke them down into small pieces and made it a little bit easier for, of course, one person doing a small task over and over again is quicker and easier than someone building all the parts of something or designing all the pieces of something and then putting them together, right? So it's what's called, they did try to call it scientific management.
At the micro level to speed up work. He wanted to break away from the common sense rules of thumb that he saw as unproven and inefficient. So workers had their own self-styled ways of doing things that they would pass around, and he said, hey, there's really no way to know if this is the best way to do things, so let's study it. Scientific management is also known as Taylorism, which of course is named after him. Division of labor is a practice that he believed in. He wanted to divide work process into very small, simple, and separate steps, division of labor. And that meant instead of doing a whole project where you did it from beginning to end, you would only do one or two little steps, and then the next task was performed by the next person. So this is a very different way to do work at the time. He wanted to determine the one best way, a standard, to do every part, every task to boost productivity. That's what he's really known for, looking for that one best way to solve the riddle. He also believed in hierarchy. He wanted a clear chain of command that separated all the employees at the bottom of the organization from all the managerial people toward the top. And the reason he wanted to do this was that he wanted the managers to design the work process and enforce how that work was performed. Employees, as a result, would just follow directions.
Which includes resources, right? So the organization of resources, setting of goals. So really Taylor came up with about 4 or 5 revolutionary ideas at the same time. One of them was to produce, to figure out what's the best way to do a job or to do one particular task, to actually measure the movements of people, to see what level of task, what can be done, how much someone can carry over and over again before they, their back is broken, before they die from it, and do just up to that point. of how much someone can actually work doing the same, carrying something over and over. He also had, he built this management system, separated the workers from the managers more, and he was also responsible for, like I said, setting goals for employees, measuring the actual work of employees.
Became doers, and the managers were then the thinkers. He believed in selection and training and compensation in a way that was a little different at the time. He wanted to select and train high-performing workers, or what he called first-class employees, and then match them to a job that was best suited for them. He saw this as the ideal. And he believed that the most productive workers should be paid more. He thought, on average, that most employees were not very hard workers, and he didn't have a very high opinion of employees, and he wanted to get rid of those people, and if they couldn't meet the higher standard, he would fire them.
So let's think about that idea a little bit. So by setting goals and targets and having really the beginning of KPIs, that's the revolutionary idea. By having the beginning of KPIs, now you have some goals for what other employees should do, right? So you have the best employees who are able to reach the targets that Taylor is setting, and so other workers are expected to keep up with that work. Now we can separate workers into different groups, strong performers and weak performers. So, and that would lead to differences in salary. It seems very obvious to us today that money would be a motivator for people, and that if you could get people and pay them a higher salary, they would work harder. And that might be true if everyone is an individual, and that might work. But the workers were pretty close together as a group, and they really identified as a group. They didn't really think so much like, oh, okay, what's best for me all the time. So it didn't work at first.
Only the good people would be left. His method was called time and motion studies. That meant he wanted to figure out the least amount of time, on average, it took to perform each task, and even each part of each task. He really broke it down. What were the fewest number of motions required for each small task? He wanted employees to basically work like they were machines. As I mentioned, he was a mechanical engineer by training and background, and so that's what they do. They design and build machines, and he wanted people to act like that. His shovel experiments were a great example of a time and motion study. And so the idea here is, he said, hey, you know what? Instead of just using whatever shovel, why don't we figure out the exact amount of poundage a shovel should hold to make work the fastest. So he did experiments where he took 10 guys and he lined them up and gave them all a pile of sand or coal. And he said, I want you to take this shovel, which held about 26 pounds, and move your piles from here and about 10 feet over to there. And so they worked at it all day, and he kept track of everything with a clipboard and a timer. And at the end of the day, they went home. And then overnight, he cut off a little piece of metal off of each shovel so that it was about a pound lighter. In other words, it held about a pound less of coal or sand. And then they came back the next morning, and he told the workers, okay, remember those piles that you moved? I want you to move them back to where they were in the first place, which was probably a little frustrating for the employees, but they were getting paid, and so they did it. And he did this every night and kept taking a little bit off of the shovel until he saw the number peak. And every time they took a little bit off, the numbers went up. Then he noticed that he kept taking more and more off the shovel, and then the numbers started to go down. They were actually finishing their piles later in the day, each day on average. And so he said, oh, maybe we've passed the midpoint. So he went back to slightly larger shovels, and sure enough, the numbers went in the right direction again. And he settled on 21.5 pounds. That was the perfect amount of sand or coal that you should fit in a shovel to move the most amount in a given day. So that amount meant you could move it faster because it was a little lighter. It also meant that you could take fewer trips. So if you're using a really small shovel, you'd have to use more motions, more trips to the pile. So he figured out the ideal amount of time and motion for shoveling. And that's why, by the way, if you go into any hardware store, you're going to see all kinds of different shovels, shapes, and sizes. And this is all influenced by Frederick Taylor, his experiments, and his thinking, certainly by extension, after that. But it's not just shovels. You see this everywhere. Like today, in fact, if you go to a sub shop and order a sub, at the end of the line, they're going to ask you if you want anything on it, like mustard. And they pick up their dispenser and they do about 3 swipes across to put that mustard on. And then they kind of look up at you like, is that enough? And you decide whether or not you want more on there. There's a competitor, however, that has a nozzle with 3 spouts on it. And that means that they do 1 squeeze, 1 motion across, and now the mustard or the ketchup is done. So they're saving 2 motions. They're saving just a couple seconds on that one little step, but they're able to make that sub a little faster. Now, if you break down the process of making a sub into 20 or 30 steps, and you figure out a way to speed up each of those tiny little steps, how to cut the bread, how to put the meat on, how to put the lettuce on, how to cook it, etc. Now you can crank out more sandwiches per hour with fewer employees, more sandwiches per day total, and you're making your company more money. And it's not just subs. If you go into just about any fast food restaurant, especially the franchises, you're going to see that they have figured out a very quick method, the one best way to make almost every single product they make. If you're making 1 burger versus 2 burgers, for example, you don't make it the same way. You have to increase your productivity. So you see this just about everywhere. The guy who took this to the next level was Henry Ford. Of course, he's the founder of the Ford Motor Company. It's still in existence today, still thriving today. When he first started making cars, the car stayed in one place, and they did a little bit of time and motion studies on it, but it still took them about 12 hours to make a car from start to finish. The workers were all working around the car. And then he said, hey, let's really go crazy with the time and motion studies. And then he said, let's also make an assembly line. He didn't invent the assembly line, as they say, but he did perfect it. And so they just kept studying the process as much as they could, and they took a car from 12 hours, which is what it took to make it at the beginning, all the way down to 93 minutes. They got it just right. They say at its fastest, there was a new car rolling off the end of that assembly line every 11 seconds. It's just incredible. Boeing recently changed over the way they made their 7.
This is pretty cool. So yeah, airplanes, so cars were made in one place with all the workers surrounding the car and working on different parts together, 3 or 4 workers. It was okay for the workers in a way because they had a lot of skills. They knew a lot about cars and they understood what they were making. And once the assembly line started, of course, it was way more efficient, and it went from 12 hours to 93 minutes. Making an airplane is hard because, you usually are going to use the whole method and do it in one place because it's so big. It's hard to imagine you can make an assembly line for an airplane, but this is what Boeing did, and it's amazing, this assembly line. Check it out.
In 37s. They actually used to make it in one place, like they originally did with the cars. And then they moved it into more assembly line style, which they call a lean production, where the plane rolls along with all the tools and even the workers inside, just a few feet an hour until it's done. And from start to finish, they were able to almost triple their production rate. That's a lot of savings for the company and a lot of savings for the clients. The outcomes of Taylor's work are mixed. On the plus side, he absolutely helped people boost productivity by 200, even 400% or more in some cases, so that's a big win. More work accomplished with fewer people meant more profit for the companies and a more consistent product of arguably higher quality. So let's say if you break something on your car, you can get an exact duplicate that fits in perfectly. You don't have to have a handmade piece, which would be incredibly expensive and not necessarily higher quality. On the other side of the coin, there are some outcomes that were not so great. Companies often fail to pay employees more. This is a central part of Taylor's advice. You have to pay people more because you want to hang on to the best people and you want to keep them motivated. And he recommended they do this. Ford took that advice and he paid people double the going rate at the time, which is one of the key reasons that Ford had such great people and thrived. Most companies, however, did not do that. Managers think, employees do, was a philosophy that became normal, separated workers from the greater meaning of work. So if they're only tightening a bolt or painting a screw, then they're not really connected to that broader satisfaction of making the whole product anymore. It de-skilled employees, it made them expendable. You could find and replace somebody in just a few moments. You didn't really have a lot of skill or time invested in each person. Survival of the fittest philosophy really took over. That harsh atmosphere resulted where it was very cruel and unfeeling.
So on one hand, it was bad before, but at least like there was a certain kind of camaraderie with the group of workers who were working together. Now you had them in this massive industrial situation where they were kind of isolated, and the noise of the factory was bigger. They're only doing one thing. They're not really specialized anymore. They don't have any pride in what they're doing. That's the meaning of the work. There's of course some classic Charlie Chaplin, who used to be quite popular in Vietnam, actually, which is kind of interesting. Because we're still, like right now, we're sort of in the Industrial Revolution in Vietnam. We are part of the, we're the factory of the world right now. And so there's a lot of, you can see Charlie Chaplin in the assembly line. He was showing how these workers live, and showing how the limitations of the working style.
Section 5, lower speed, 4-7.
Anyway, just some basics in the factory there. It's not very affirming work, and it is a harsh atmosphere, and it made employees kind of critical of one another and that. So But I want to talk about pay a little bit more. So Taylor had this idea, and it was way ahead of its time, really, in one sense. In two senses, really. It was way ahead of its time, and that was that you would connect the productivity of the worker to how much money they would make. So in the system before, or leading up to this system, it's like if you could produce 10, you get paid 10 times a certain amount of money. If you could produce 15, you get paid 15. So some workers were slower, but it also made other workers faster, and it's supposed to make them more ambitious and want to complete the jobs faster so they can get more money. It makes sense in a way today. I think it makes perfect sense to everyone, except for some jobs that are very hard to measure, right? You have to be in a factory, you have to have KPIs that are measurable. But there were two main problems. Number one is this one here. Companies didn't really, the trust between the company and the employee was very low. And companies often would find some excuse not to pay the worker the extra money that they were supposed to get. But the bigger problem, and the factory that we're showing here is more of an American style 1900 factory. But in the early Taylor days, 1880s, first of all, there was only two classes really in England. There was an upper class, there was a middle class, but they weren't based on education or hard work. They were based on being traders. So there was a trader class, there was an upper class, a rich land-owning class, and then there was the working class. So imagine in these times that a worker would not really have the same motivation. It's not like, oh, okay, I want to make more money, and as a result, I'm going to be able to take care of my family, buy a house that's better, send my children to study, and then we're going to build wealth for our future generations. That's not even close to what happened. Think about it. If you're worth a working class group, right, or a union, or people who share the same values, that's a strength, right? The people who were working class were proud of being working class, right? The rich were proud, they were wine drinkers, and the working class were beer drinkers, right? They had their own cultures, their own entertainment, their own lifestyle. No one from the working class could jump to the rich class, impossible to change your class. Your class was your class. So what could you do if you worked harder? The first thing that would happen is that you would embarrass your friends who you work with, and they would be like, hey, you're making us look bad, you're working too hard, and now the boss thinks that we all should work harder because of you. So they might beat you up. They might just, have a word with you about this. Slow down. Stop making us look bad. There was no ambition, right? So imagine your friend is working hard and he's talking about moving to a better part of the city. Wow, right? How much are your friends gonna like that? They're gonna be like, oh, you think you're better than us? You think you deserve more than us? This is not good enough for you? Living with us, having our life is not good enough for you? Who are you to think that you're better than us? It's not gonna work, right? Another situation where, and again, if they were to move to another neighborhood that was not working class, then they would be looked down upon. The rich people would look on them like, oh my God, who are these people? So there was that's an American dream. That came way later. The American dream was not the early industrial revolutionary dream. Last but not least, let's imagine you and your friends are working in a factory, and you're the hardest worker of the group, and you're trying to earn more money. The entertainment of the day was to go and work in to get drunk in a bar, pubs, publics, as they were known. And in the pub, you and your friends are gonna try to forget about the factory day and have something else on your mind, the football scores or whatever. And so what do? You drink. And who pays? You, because you work harder and you have more money. So come on, big guy, buy us all some drinks. So all the money that you would make that would be extra money is just gonna go to like supporting the drinking habits of your friends. So there's no motivation that fits. Just making money in itself wasn't a big motivation. Think about Maslow too. Belonging, much more powerful in this kind of environment than status or something like that. So Taylorism, eventually, the idea of paying more and motivating people when there was something to get, when there's a goal, we're going to talk about this later. You can motivate people with rewards, but there has to be a reward that they want to have for it to actually work. The last thing I'm going to show today is another little bit about Taylor, and it's got some good notes. The one that I showed first here, good old Jim and the Tutor to You group presents us with the idea of Taylor. Taylor is called Taylorism. Taylorism is a philosophy of efficiency, KPIs, very basic external rewards. It's all based on external rewards.
Hi there. In this business topic video, we're going to take a look at one more of the well-known and important motivational theorists. We'll take a quick look at the work of Frederick Taylor and his association with a theory called scientific management. Taylor, of course, is just one of several well-known motivational theorists who you'll come across in your business studies, Maslow and Hertzberg.
And this is the general order that we will follow.
Particularly well known along with Pink and others. But in this video we're just going to focus on Taylor and his concept of scientific management and what that meant for how he believed that employees should be motivated at work. A bit about Taylor. Frederick Taylor, he was an American engineer, and of course you can see from the dates of his birth and death that he was around some time ago, 1856 to 1917. And his focus was in understanding how manufacturing could be organised in the most efficient and most productive way. His obsession, if you like, was on management of manufacturing operations and to maximise the efficiency and lower the unit cost of production. And his approach, which was coined as scientific management. So when we think of management, I don't know if it's emphasized for every class, but management is, when we think, let me just highlight. So when we think of business environment, we think of what? PEST. So when you're answering exam questions on this topic, anytime that you see a question that talks about business environment, you should be thinking about PEST. And the goal is to get you to think about all the things that you can write about, right? Political, economic, social, and technological. And that way you have more things to consider for your answer on a test. If you're talking about marketing, we should be talking about the 4 Ps, right? Every time marketing comes up, you should be like, okay, 4 Ps, or maybe 5 people. And then address each one of those Ps. And this is about management. And management is what? Planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. Controlling means to check to see if the goals are met. And that's POLC, POLC. So whenever you see something about management, scientific management, human resource management,
consumer or customer management, customer relationship management, you should think about POLC. Stick in your brain, POLC. So in this case, really Taylor comes into effect when he's talking about not only controlling and setting KPIs, right? That's a part of setting goals and planning, but also making sure the resources are there and which shovels they're going to use. So that's organizing resources. Not so much motivation for leadership, not so much leadership, and a lot of controlling, a lot of measurement, a lot of checking. The one thing that's not included here a lot of times is how it relates to staffing needs. And you can think of the staffing needs like how many staff does it need in order to do a job. So I have a really nice example I'll use for next time about that.
It was all about understanding how things were done well and then designing management processes and production processes around the best ways of doing things in order to produce at the right quality at the lowest unit cost. And he did this through an approach that was about measurement, monitoring the workers and controlling them. Now, Taylor's view on employees, as evidenced by this quote here, might suggest to you and I that he didn't have a lot of time for the humble manufacturing or production worker. But of course, don't forget that when Taylor was around, there was quite a different culture in organisations, particularly in businesses. Very much a them and us approach. But you get a sense, don't you, from this quote as to how he considered the value or importance of employees in the production process. We don't want initiative. We don't want employees to think for themselves. All we want them to do is to obey what we tell them to do, to get on with it, and to do it quickly. That was the basis of his principles of scientific management. And of course, it therefore reflected in the way that he thought employees should be and could be motivated. His scientific approach is summarised here on this chart. You'll never need to replicate this or produce this in an exam answer or essay, but it's just worth remembering the context in which Taylor was trying to identify his motivational theory, which was around, as I said, this idea of looking at how production was organised most efficiently, spotting through work study the employees who appeared to be the most productive, the most efficient. What was it about them, about the way they worked, how they worked? How could that be replicated so that everybody else in the organisation doing the same job followed the same procedures? Training everybody else to reach that same standard, and then focusing the minds of those employees who the business decided to keep on productivity, on efficiency. In other words, paying them for what they made. And therefore, the key thing to remember about Taylor is that his view about what motivated employees in the workforce was very simple. Pay, financial rewards, money. That was the most important, perhaps the only factor that determined how efficient and how productive and how motivated they were. So the answer to motivation, as far as Taylor was concerned, was to set targets, to reward employees who met those targets, and clearly the business might want to get rid of the employees who didn't meet the targets. And this led to, and was the basis for a concept which you've probably come across in motivation studies called Peace rate. Peace rate is paying per unit of output. Now, of course, there are some significant implications if you buy into Taylor's theory of what motivates employees, which is money. Firstly, he would advocate, and firms who followed his theory advocate, that the best way to motivate employees is to pay them based on their output and to very closely control and supervise them at work. That ties in quite nicely and links to this concept of an autocratic style of leadership and management. Telling people what to do, making decisions and requiring that they implement them. Peace rate being the method by which the employee feels motivated to work hard. Does Taylor's theory still ring true in the modern world? It's a long time since he did his scientific management study, and the best part of it.
Over 100 years later, we have the old complaints that we hear at Amazon about workers who don't get to take bathroom breaks because they'll lose productivity, that they are not supposed to talk to each other when they're working. You have a timer for the delivery drivers. So if they don't deliver the next package before the timer tells them that they're going too slowly, that they'll lose salary and maybe their jobs. So this stuff is still going on.
100 years since he passed away. Well, of course, piece rates, or paying employees for what they produce, has been a common and popular feature of work in many industries for a long time, and to some extent it still exists. Just a couple of examples of where you might make a link to modern business practice to Taylor's theories of motivation. In recent years, businesses like Amazon and other e-commerce businesses have been accused of operating what's known as sweatshop conditions in some of their e-commerce warehouses. Some quite famous documentaries that go behind the scenes of what happens when you order goods. The employees there, lots of them on temporary contracts, to a large extent highly controlled, monitored and rewarded based on how efficient and productive they are. And of course you can make a nice link between Taylor and the conditions that arise perhaps in manufacturing facilities in emerging markets, where employees are very much seen as a resource, and you try to get the most productive and efficient use out of them, and you pay them on a piece rate. So we see this, or have seen this historically in the factories operated by the manufacturers supplying some of the world's best known brands and retailers. So look out for maybe making a link between Taylor's piece rates concept, the motivational concept, and the implications of running sweatshops in emerging markets. Just one to think about. There we go, that's a brief introduction to the motivational theory of Frederick Taylor, or scientific management as it's known.
Okay guys, I'm gonna wrap it up here. I think it's been about an hour. And that's the length of videos that I feel good about making. I don't make 90-minute videos. Those are like real movies. Anyway, the last point that he made leads into next year, and of course the issue of sweatshops and working conditions in developing countries. So it's still alive. A lot of these issues are still alive, but this is a motivation, just to finalize, this is a motivation, again, that is really much built on external rewards, right? Who cares what the worker thinks? You want to make more money, you work harder, don't tell me how you feel, just work or don't work. So all of that is changed. A lot of that has changed in different kinds of industries. And labor unions have got a lot of rights for workers, as we saw in Australian law. Okay, have a great weekend. Bye guys.